Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Luke Timmerman. I'm the founder and editor of Timmerman Report, biotech industry newsletter. Started a little over a year ago. Also do some freelance writing for Forbes and a podcast you should check out on statnews.com, new publication out of Boston. Pleasure to be here today talking about the biotech industry and this pretty amazing run that's occurred the last really 3 years. A big up, and then more recent in the last, say, 6-9 months, a big decline. We have a great cast of panelists here today with a diverse range of perspectives. So I think I'll just maybe start here on my left with brief introductions. John Reed runs R&D at Roche, one of the major diversified R&D companies in the industry. Next to me, Annalisa Jenkins. She's CEO of Dimension Therapeutics, gene therapy company that went public just last October. So she's got some interesting tales to tell from the IPO roadshow. Next to me on my right, Bob Hugen, Executive Chairman of Celgene, one of the big industry leaders in biotech. And I was just at an investor conference a couple days ago where one of his partners called Celgene the kingmaker on Wall Street. I don't think Bob thinks of himself this way among early stage companies, but if you look at Celgene's business development portfolio, they've done a lot of venture capital work, have a lot of fingers in a lot of pots. Very interesting, innovative companies. And on the end, Alex Denner of Sarissa Capital Management. He's a financial guy, an activist investor, value investor, looks for bargains, which was not exactly what most people were doing during 2013, 2014, and the first part of 2015, a historic bull run. So, can we bring up our first slide? Because I think there's a lot you can get from just looking at this simple chart. On top, NASDAQ Biotech Index performance, you can see this incredible outperformance over the broader NASDAQ composite in those years, especially 2013, 14, 15. And we saw about 150 companies take advantage of that and go public during those years, raised $20 billion in aggregate or more. Lots of interesting science got funded there. Gene therapy, RNA therapies, immuno-oncology, a lot of cool things coming out of the lab. But if you could put that back up there quick, you can see the top. And that was about July, mid to late July of last year, the air started coming out. And this has been a big, big decline. And it's changed how companies operate. So I guess maybe I could start with Annalisa. How did that phenomenon, that intense inflation for a couple years, followed by the decline, how has that affected your world?
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a really interesting ride. I actually believe, and I often say to people, that our industry, the biotech industry, took a little bit of a detour, a sojourn. If you look at the graph, of course, we set out, and this all started in about 2012, 2013. And essentially, what was happening was that there was a new market being created, a new market of investors. And I remember sitting in a panel in about 2012, actually, where the long-standing traditional venture capitalists, expert biotech investors, were lamenting the fact they could no longer get a seat at the table on IPOs or follow-ons because there was this enormous wave of new investors entering the market. And what did that mean? Well, what it meant was that the discussions that companies like mine were having with investors had changed remarkably from, let me tell you about the science, and let's deep dive into the team, the science, the path forward, where we see value, to, let me just tell you I'm a gene therapy company. If you like gene therapy, I guess you're going to put money in. And, I don't want to be too facetious about it, but I will tell you that we started this little company a couple of years ago, and we had $5 million in the bank and 11 employees in October 2014. In 2015, we closed an A round, a B round, and took the company public in 9 months. We raised over $140 million. And I used to wake up in the morning and sort of say, well, I'm an R&D geek. I was in Big Pharma for 20 years. It can't be this easy. It can't be this easy. Now, can I tell you, wind forward to today, it's not that easy. And I was just saying, it's actually probably more intellectually interesting today, because it's gone back to how it used to be, which is you have to show value. You have to show that the science probably is going to work. You have to understand the risk. And you have to ask investors really to step forward, and really truly understand what you have in your hands and whether they want to be part of the journey with you. So I have to tell you, it's just been this complete roller coaster of a ride.
It's really hard to overstate how big a change this was. We were just talking beforehand about the post-financial crisis years, 2008 through about, let's say, middle of 2012. Really good companies, good technology, good data, good management teams, blue chip partnerships could not go public. Nobody was buying. And now Annalise is here saying, she'd walk into meetings and people would say, gene therapy? Put me in for $5 million.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And, it created an interesting challenge because, when you're trying to capitalize the company and you're a scientist and you want to create new medicines, you're always trying to take the long view. So you really want to make sure that you have the right investors coming with you, particularly if you're in the private world, because, you want people who are knowledgeable. So I would say to you that we can't understate the uniqueness of the last 24 to 48 months. And what that has created for us today is a moment in time. Because what it really did do was create hundreds, literally hundreds, of newly public little companies that still have an enormous amount of risk to discharge, because we're in an innovative risk industry. And I think that's really where we find ourselves today. And now, of course, we're going to talk about what that means moving forward.
Yeah, so some of the air has come out of the bubble. I think most people up here would agree with that. Is there a silver lining?
I could tell you there is from the standpoint of big pharma, because that means prices have come down now to access external innovation. All big pharma companies depend to a large extent on external innovation for our pipelines, depending on the company. Maybe in the case of Roche, it's about a third of our products are originated from partners. In some cases, other companies, it may be more like 2/3. But prices have been high, and now they're coming back to more reasonable levels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You don't see as many billion-dollar valuations on companies with data from 2 patients.
Yeah, with preclinical assets for $1 billion, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about
Yeah, look, I think that the market was mispricing risk. This is sort of the normal cycles that you see in many industries, and particularly in biotech, where as Annalisa mentioned, years ago nobody wanted to fund anything, and then all of a sudden it becomes hot, and people sort of forget about really what the risk is in these names. So when you do an early stage research, the probability of success in that individual program is quite low. Like, people use about 90% failure in phase 1 is sort of a number that's typically used. So you think about, out of every 10 drugs that enter human testing, 9 of them will fail, and only 1 will actually get approved. So there's a lot of risk in this business. Now, there's enormous value that will be created over time. Obviously, there's been value that's been created so far, and I believe more will be created over time. But one has to really think about, in times like 2014 and 2015, as an investor, you have to think about, okay, what are the probabilities that the market is implying for success in the different programs the company has. And for us, we had difficulty investing in a lot of those names because we couldn't get to the valuations. Now that things have come down, it's a very interesting situation. So that's the index, but yet there are names that are down, from that July high, much more than that. So there's quite a bit of dispersion around here. There's a lot of volatility, in the last, say, 12 months. So for us, it's created a lot of opportunities, and I think it will create a lot of opportunities, as John said, for M&A for larger companies too.
I think that in the audience, I suspect we've got some people that are incredible experts and others that have more of a generalist perspective on the industry. And I want to give you a little bit of reassurance about what I think these curves mean. And I think in our sector, because of the high risk and also the high opportunity when you are successful, you have these kinds of surges where expectations go very high, or it can be so depressed that you get because the results are going to be binary. And the one thing we're sure of, the price is wrong of where it is today, because if it's right, it's going to be much higher. And if it doesn't work out, it's going to be much lower. But I think over time, there's two things that I would reassure you with about these curves. One is the business model of the companies that we are operating with or Alex invests in, is that maybe 15 years ago, you could make money by marketing something. Today, the business model, if you don't make a meaningful difference in someone's life, improving the quality or length of life, there is no business model. And secondly, the science is phenomenal. The advances that we're making, we are on the edge of tremendous acceleration with a combination of the revolution of molecular biology with information technology really finally being applied to our sector to really accelerate the advances. So it is driven fundamentally by the science with high risk, which means picking out one stock is a dangerous thing for someone who is not incredibly expert. Having a portfolio is important. But these trends are real and they're related to the advances in science. And I think talking about the near term is very important, because there is no long term if you're not successful, and the kind of moves that can happen in the short run are very significant. But I do hope later in the conversation we can talk about some of the incredibly impactful themes that are driving healthcare and are going to drive our sector over the next 10 or 15 years, which are encouraging, but are important decisions that you need to make as to where and how to invest. It's going to change, in my opinion, a bit.
I'm glad you brought up the fundamentals, because when I look at that, it looks very positive, generally. You really think just basically about an aging population. A lot of boomers are getting to the point where they need a lot of health care. The science is moving really fast. The FDA is constructive, by and large, many of its divisions. It's hard to generalize, but there's a new effort to engage with patients. I think patients are becoming more constructive advocates in many ways. There's a lot of money in the sector now behind a lot of good science. There's all these society investments that have matured over time at different degrees. But I think this does naturally bring up that slide which John wanted to show. We'll get the second one here, the hype cycle. So what happens here, and we see this over and over in biotech, is that there's often a technology trigger. Something happens that's exciting in the science, like, say, the discovery of CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. And imaginations go wild with possibilities. And that's great. You raise a lot of money, and scientists go forth and do a lot of cool things. But it's impossible to value these things with any degree of accuracy over a long period of time. So things tend to get carried away. And and then when people realize that it's much harder to reduce these things to viable products after a year or two, they tend to fall into that trough of disillusionment. And inevitably, we've seen this over and over with monoclonal antibodies. I think we're beginning to see it with viral vector gene therapy, RNA therapies. Some companies that raised money when they could, they just grind it out behind the scenes. They stick to it. They whack their way through the hornet's nest of technical challenges and work their way up that slope of enlightenment to where it becomes routine. And you think about antibodies, I think we're there. The PCSK9 antibodies are a great story. From biological discovery to FDA-approved product with something like less than 5 years. Mm-hmm. It's really remarkable, a testament to decades of investment. So I think there's there's good reason to be excited about the fundamentals long term as these things mature.
I want to pick up on something that you said, which is that I've been around for 20 years doing R&D in biopharma, and I would say that, we were talking about this, today is one of the most exciting times to be in R&D in biopharma. And why is that? Because biotech has, to a certain extent, matured on the back of the whole growth in antibody technology. And on the back of that has spawned so much understanding, in related areas. And the two things that get me excited every day is, one is the deeper understanding of the molecular basis of disease. And this conference, there's been a number of sessions talking about genomics and genetics and all that sort of thing. So the understanding of the molecular biology of disease. And the second thing is our ability to develop new sophisticated tools to get to those targets, and the use of information technology. Now, if you put those three together, it's not a perfect storm, it's the opposite. you have this amazing environment in which, you know, ideation, creativity can start to spawn all these new ideas. So in gene therapy, there are a number of these inherited metabolic disorders that we have never been able to get to. We've tried and tried to be able to help young people with missing enzymes and proteins. Now we have the opportunity with these new tools to really start to offer opportunities for these kids that we could never have done 10 to 12 years ago. And by the way, it was 30 years of academic research in AAV gene therapy that was going on, funded largely by the NIH, that brought us to this moment in time. So I actually do believe that we're at an extremely exciting point, and that today we're just looking in the rearview mirror saying, yeah, there was a bubble, okay? There was a bubble. But to your point, it's a really exciting time to be in biotech investing and R&D.
You think about gene therapy, for instance. I mean, I think that made the cover of Time magazine in 1991.
Yeah, it did.
Like, we're going to get cures, magic bullets for rare genetic diseases. And what generation of, so with gene therapy, you need genetically modified viruses to deliver the gene into cells to get that kind of action that you're looking for. What, are we on the third or fourth generation of those vectors? And
we're going into the AAV, they call it 3.0. I think another important point is that it's not just about being able to find the right vectors and understand the genomic basis of disease and be able to manipulate these therapeutics. The other very important point is you've got to be able to make it. And, you know, the evolution of innovation in manufacturing and CMC has been quite remarkable over the last 10 to 15 years. And again, we would not be in this position today with gene therapy and other related therapies if we hadn't also seen the progress that's been made in the manufacturing CMC side of the business.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting to see some of the changes happening there with companies like Samsung getting into biologics and creating what they say is going to be the world's largest biologics manufacturing capability. So, you know, who'd have thunk, you know, it's these, and it gets a little bit this convergence of fields maybe even where an electronics company is looking at biosimilars and getting into biologic drugs, biotech drugs like monoclonal antibodies. So interesting times.
yeah, that's not immediately transferable from the cell phone to incubating live cells and popping out proteins. But let's talk too about some of the headwinds. There are genuine headwinds facing the industry. Number one, around pricing. There was the famous tweet by Hillary Clinton, I believe, about price gouging pharmaceutical companies right after Mr. Shkreli was highlighted in the New York Times, September of 2015. And we've since seen a lot more of these stories come out about excessive pricing. And a whole conversation has emerged now about defining the value. And you alluded to this, Bob. How are we going to solve get around this issue and come up with better definitions of value?
No, I think it's a fundamental issue that I think investors have to have a perspective on and a view on to invest in this sector. Just as you know, John's hype curve, you need to understand the stage of technology that you're investing in so that you don't get yourself in at the peaks and then get out at the troughs, and you find that kind of important cycle is a short-term cycle, and then you have the longer-term cycles that we'll talk about also. And pricing is one of those external factors that I think we have to have a good understanding of. And frankly, every 8 years we're going to come into this issue of pricing, and the issue of pharmaceutical pricings and paying for innovation has been something that has been a front-page story of the New York Times since the 1860s. So it is something that's been with us a long time. I think the issue of politics is very important. It is probably not the most fundamental driver of where we're going to go on the issue. It's really overarching economics. We are in a very significant race of demographics in our all developed world in terms of the cost of caring for aging populations. That is a real significant social issue, and we were in discussions last night about diabetes and what the cost of that is, and certainly Alzheimer's with $1 trillion in 2040. So we have a overarching economic issue in the entire developed world that will undermine the fundamental economics. We will not have any discretionary spending in societies if we don't deal with Alzheimer's, metabolic disease, and cancer, also a disease generally of the elderly. So we have this issue of we have to find how can we afford to care for these people today, but yet discover the solutions, invent the solutions that are going to give us a long-term economics answer to these issues. It's incredibly challenging to do, and that's why I think we need to have a very transparent discussion about value to ensure the judgments we make and where we and how we think about these things. But it's not such a simple issue. Certainly in the US, Andrew Whitty was here on Sunday and I thought gave an outstanding talk that said in the US, the list price is one thing, but the average net price to a pharmaceutical company is like 45% lower. And the costs that go into other components of the system are things that we're not involved in. And the economic impact that our industry has in America is one of the greatest offsets. And I think when we think longer term, we invent all the generics. There are no generic companies out there inventing 90% of the prescriptions that are prescribed in the United States today which are generic. And the one part of the ecosystem of healthcare that we can tell you will be lower cost a decade from now are drugs. Doctor fees, hospital costs, all these things are not going to be lower, most probably, but drug costs will be lower because they're going to go to generic, and we see that happening. So I think we need a very robust discussion about value. It's a very tough one, and I think that you've started to see some think tanks come up that really are driven by one component of the ecosystem that are not giving us a full, fair, comprehensive view of it. I think we're going to see over the next year or so much more engaged, balanced views on how to establish the value proposition. But the one thing I will tell you from an investment point of view is that I think you do have to think about the longer term trends of the societal needs. We must have an answer for neurodegenerative disease. We must have answers for metabolic disease. We must have answers for cancer because the economic consequences are so much. So we're going to have to, as a society, invest in those places, and we're going to have to incent people to do that, and that's where you're going to see the opportunity in the shorter term and in the longer term. So it's a real issue. We should never be afraid to talk about it. If we cannot justify the price, and it's a tough one because we're at such a structural disadvantage as a drug company. We had hospitalization insurance, we had doctor's insurance, et cetera. Remember, Americans pay 3 or 4% of their hospital costs, maybe 6 or 7% of their physician's costs. Americans pay out of their pocket 24% or so of their drug costs. They think drugs cost the most in the healthcare system. Drugs have been for the last, I think, 60 years, about 10% of healthcare costs, maybe 11%. But because of the structural issues of how what we call insurance, of these high deductibles and specialty tiers, we make the sick people disproportionately pay for their care as opposed to being insured across the whole population. So we have a very structural challenge that you go to a hospital and you get a $10,000 or an $8,000 deductible for a $200,000 week stay of intensive care, and then you get your drug bill, which is almost the same. You think, what's crazy here? And so we have structural issues. The society needs to understand this is a serious issue. It's one that we need to be engaged in, and we need to have the right answers, because if we cut off innovation, the consequences to our world are so much greater.
Bob,
but we got to deal with the reality today also.
let me challenge you a little bit on this. Has the pharmaceutical industry overreached a bit? I mean, because we see stories, and it's not just a couple of bad apples. We see a lot of companies that are really dependent on raising prices, double-digit percentages, every 6 months in some cases, to meet their quarterly earnings objectives for Wall Street.
I think there's no doubt there's no one is blameless and no one has been completely transparent on the issue. But let's remember, 11 years maybe is the exclusivity that you have to recoup the investment that you've made and to fund the investment for the next 15 years when you don't know whether it's going to work or not. And the average time to have competitive threat in your pricing, in your market, is now 5 to 6 years. So you have a much shorter period of time to make your return to invest in the future. Yes, people have absolutely made mistakes, but on the other hand, think about what Lipitor costs today. Think about what Gleevec costs today. And so the society with 90% generic drugs benefits from these investments, and we have to make sure that we hold, as investors and ourselves and us as management, hold ourselves accountable. Are we spending enough? and reinvesting that money in R&D that's going to make a difference. And we shouldn't be investing in companies that are not spending and putting their money, investing in places that are going to use those proceeds. We don't take government money. This is where we get our investment, but we've got to be held our feet to the fire that we're putting it back where it belongs.
Okay. What do you think,
I
Alex?
just build on that
agree
with,
completely.
Another factoid. So if you look at a company like Roche, Swiss pharmaceutical company, been around for over 100 years, we have over 50 medicines that are on the WHO list of essential medicines that are available today for less than $1 a day. And that's really, I think, the contract with society, right? If society will reward innovation, all these innovations have defined patent lives, and as you mentioned, if you're lucky, you get a decade of exclusivity, and even then it's under a lot of competition. After that, those drugs will be offered by generics companies that ride the coattails of the companies that do the investment at risk, and will be available to society for very little cost.
We've not been very good as an industry, I don't think.
terrible.
So I worked a lot in the HIV field in the late 90s and was in R&D, and frankly, at the time felt embarrassed, angry, upset about the way that the overall industry set out to provide market access to these life-saving and life-enhancing drugs. And I remember at the time thinking, because I'd been in academia, I'd come into the industry, is this where I want to build my career? And I can tell you that there's been a remarkable transformation in our industry.
Yes.
There's always going to be bad apples, exceptions to the rule. But I think we've done a pretty poor job as an industry really articulating, the way that within many companies, employees come to work every day because they want the therapeutics to be made available to patients on a global basis to extend and enhance their lives. And I just want to make one other point. I know Alex wants to jump in. We know what happens when incentives go the other way. We have a crisis in this country with multi-drug resistant organisms, Clostridium difficile, gonorrhea. And the reason we have that is because there were no incentives in our industry for this translation of academic research into therapeutics and biotechs and
Antibiotics.
beyond. Antibiotics.
Antibiotics.
It's a crisis.
Yes.
And so this goes back to incentives. We don't need to reflect on what will happen if the incentives are removed for an innovative pharmaceutical industry. We have a brilliant case study. Now, the good news, that's being rectified now, but that was a fantastic case study.
I would agree that there are certain classes of drugs that we should be paying more for. And antibiotics are kind of a victim of their own success. They were so good, and now the whole healthcare system expects them to be basically 100% curative and dirt cheap or free.
Yes.
And that has created a situation where you don't have incentives for people to develop new drugs, and people are wondering why we've got multi-drug resistant bacteria now. So it is a nuanced kind of story. But Alex, you...
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Look, I think that, apropos Bob and Annalise's points, that the pharma industry really had it kind of too easy for a long time. And this is not a company like Celgene. When you guys were small, it was very easy to just kind of pump up prices. The model basically was, you come up with an innovative product every once in a while, and you can't predict when. So you would, when a drug came out, the pharma companies would often sort of copy and make a Me Too version. So that's why you have a lot of different versions of, Roche innovated on benzodiazepines, but there are hundreds of benzodiazepines, hundreds of SSRIs, or many SSRIs, that kind of thing. So the industry would just sort of, when there is no innovation, use pricing to provide very reliable earnings growth for investors. And I think the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, as distinct from biotech, also got, kind of very lazy with allocating capital. And a specific example of that is R&D. So R&D productivity of sort of 10 years ago kind of fell away in the traditional pharmaceutical industry. That was more than made up for by what was occurring in biotech at the time. So a lot of many of the advances that we've seen in medicine actually came from little companies or biotech companies that maybe got bought by pharma or their drugs got licensed there. And but going forward, the idea of like if you think of what was happening in the past, okay, that people would set a price in each country that was the maximum price they could get. people would set
What the market will bear.
what the market will bear and not be too concerned about reimportation, things like that. Now I think people look at this thing much more holistically. This is much more, the payers do not accept, Me Too drugs that have very little additional value being as a patent extension strategy or as just or to compete with an innovative product. So what we need, what society now is demanding is innovative therapies that produce a lot of, they do something, ameliorate disease in some tangible way. And to the extent we do that, I think it's okay to get pricing there. And what a lot of what we're dealing with is the past, when the industry was sort of really not as careful about that and said, okay, well, we didn't come up with anything innovative now, so we're going to kind of crank up our prices.
I'm glad you brought up the R&D productivity issue, because that's a dragon that the industry hasn't yet slayed.
Not at all.
This idea that, what does it cost to develop a new drug now on average? $2 billion, depending on whose set of figures you believe. When you factor in all the failures, $2.6 billion. Well, that's a big problem. The industry needs to figure out how to bring that down, to make it, to build on our better understanding of molecular biology so that it doesn't take 10 years and $2.6 billion to get that next FDA-approved product. Yeah. And if you can make an impact there, well, now you perhaps have a little more pricing flexibility, and you can still give Wall Street the margins they expect, and the whole risk-reward equation holds together.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good thing to build on. The interesting thing is that actually when you look at most big pharmas, they don't return the cost of capital. So it is an interesting risk-reward sort of challenge we have with investment. But I think as Bob was pointing out, the science and the convergence of technologies is creating so much opportunity now for gains in efficiency. Genomics becoming widespread, the fact that all of us will have a genome sequence probably within the next 5 years, I would guess, means that we're really starting to dissect the heterogeneity of human disease so we can really target medicines for patients better. That's very much the Roche strategy. We're the world's largest in vitro diagnostics company and one of the largest therapeutics, and we bring those together around a mantra, personalized healthcare. But of course, everybody in the industry is doing the same and realizing that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach we can use here. We have to personalize therapies, and as we do so, we'll be more successful because it'll be grounded in a firm understanding of disease heterogeneity. And then other things like real-world data and big data and the convergence of IT. We made an investment in Flatiron, for example, which is an electronic medical records company in the oncology space because we're the #1 oncology company. And that's really to be able to mine those data so that we have a better understanding of where the need is, how to design our clinical trials, how our approved medicines are performing in the real world of the marketplace. We hope from those kind of things there'll be an era where we don't need placebo control arms anymore, where we'll be able to basically use virtual data to say, okay, here's what the standard of care delivers, and now let's create a cohort of patients that matches that and test our therapeutic. And so this automatically will drive down the cost of clinical trials and frankly be better for patients, because then you don't have to subject patients to be randomized to maybe something that's not innovative.
Are we going to get to better definitions of value that people can agree on through these kind of systems?
I think
because I got to tell you, there's this big disconnect. You know this, between what the payers think is value and what the pharma companies think.
Yeah. Well, how about wait a minute? Let's make sure the patient is at the center of that discussion.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because when we say the payer determines value or we determine value, they better have the patient an important part of that consideration, should be the primary consideration. And then we and the payer have to figure out a way to make it work, because that's a big mistake if we don't start with that premise whenever we talk about value.
Sure.
Then we need the flexibility, though. Right now, the way, at least in America, the way drugs are reimbursed, it's sort of it's a cost per pill or per vial. And we need more flexible ways to do that. So, for example, if you look at one experiment we're doing in Italy, where they're allowing this, is with our drug Avastin. It's approved for 8 types of cancer, but it delivers different levels of value for those 8 types of cancers in terms of the benefit. So we're offering that in Italy at 8 different prices, depending on what you use that medicine for. So that's an example of the
Can you do that in the U.S.?
Not legally, no.
I don't think so.
But you can, it just makes your lower price becomes the benchmark.
But these definitions of value, there really is a gap there. I mean, in the PCSK9 story, I don't know how many people here know, but that is a good case study, an evolving one right at the very moment, where you've got excellent molecular biology for lowering cholesterol, much lower than you can with existing statins. You've got terrific clinical trial data showing that you can lower LDL cholesterol much lower with PCSK9 directed antibodies from a couple of major companies. And these drugs were approved by the FDA, people cheered, stocks went up on this, people were projecting billions of dollars in valuation, and the payers slammed on the brakes and said no. And that's because they don't yet have the data that shows they can actually deliver value to the patient or to the payer in the thing that really counts, which is the reduction of heart attacks and strokes. Now that data is coming.
But this is really critical because this is a topic around relative differentiated benefit. Because, at the end of the day, we have statins and they're all generic and they're cheap. And so at the end of the day, and they're very good, and many of the companies that we've all worked at invested a lot of R&D money into their pipelines on the back of the cash they made from statins. So I think that the PCSK9s, I think, is a fascinating story because it does reflect the evolution of the sophistication of the healthcare payer system. Because the payers are absolutely saying, today, we do not believe that there is significant, sufficient, relative differentiated benefit versus a statin.
Is lower LDL better?
And so what they're waiting for is obviously the big outcome studies to see whether that lowering will reduce heart attacks and strokes. And I think that is a function now of a difference in the way we should be developing drugs. So if you ask me in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, what I think drug development is going to look like, I don't think we're going to have this classical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, file, label, a few other. I think we're already seeing this in oncology. We're going to say, can you deliver me sufficient evidence of a remarkable benefit to patients through a certain data set? And then you're going to be obligated to be pursuing some of the bigger studies, which really document the total impact on health. And then we'll have to think about models of pricing and reimbursement and market access that evolve with that. We're trying to use an old-fashioned model of market access and pricing to apply to a completely new era of scientific and medical innovation.
New markers of success.
Yes, it's like a gene therapy. I mean, I'll just tell you. I'll just say, a 30-minute single infusion with the potential to cure hemophilia. Potential. Okay. How much would you charge for that? It's a 30-minute one-off infusion. And of course, yes, should it be 1 million? Should it be 2 million? Should it be 3 million? The second question is, how should healthcare systems reimburse that? Should we charge 500,000 up front? And while the drug still works every year, should we then charge in a couple of 100,000? Can't do that in the US today. Those models today are absolutely in place in Europe. Value pricing models.
We're not set up to handle that just yet, but Bob, what do you want to say?
I think we'd be unrealistic to believe that we will, in the next X number of years, create one model that we will agree on value for. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and we shouldn't recognize that we may need a range of models, and that in certain situations, we're going to default to one or the other because we think it's more important. In this case, the impact on patients is so severe and so valuable, we're going to defer to one. But I think we need an honest discussion, a comprehensive discussion about value, because what we've got today is a couple of people who are putting out models that do nothing but are cost minimization, which is short-term cost minimization, which increases the long-term. Remember, the CBO changed the scoring for government and Medicare and Medicaid, that 1% increase in prescription usage leads to a reduction in other costs of other medical services. So we've got to be careful that we don't do short-term things that lead to long-term costs. So we want to recognize we're not going to solve the value discussion today, this month, this year, but we need multiple perspectives on it so that we can make more informed judgments of where we invest our money and where we don't.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And I think Annalise's example of hemophilia is a great example. So let's say that thing works and it costs $1 million. You can cure a patient with hemophilia when they are 18. and they can now live a productive life the rest of their life, hold a job, and without any of the baggage of being a patient and worrying about a bleeding episode. That's worth a lot. And you don't want to create a system where we have, say, reference pricing, where you base the reference off of something that's way too low to properly reward that kind of benefit.
Yeah, I feel, one thing is interesting that, and you see this a lot, Alex, which is that in the old days, I remember I used to sit around R&D tables with my commercial colleagues, and we would be thinking about which technologies to advance into the clinic or which technologies to push through the pipeline. And we used to have this thing called an EMPV, which I used to call it the antithesis of innovation, which was that we used to be asked, as we were in the preclinical setting, to try and predict the peak sales of a product in 10 to 15 years' time. And I used to say that's an unknowable unknown. And they said, well, if you can't tell us that it's going to be a blockbuster in those days, do you remember that? Blockbusters. Then we're not going to invest in it. And I remember thinking, this is insane. This is insane. And so I think that we're still in this position.
But I think most companies have learned that lesson.
I wanted to say that.
I'll give you a good example.
That now has evolved.
Yeah, a good example with Roche. When we were offered the opportunity to buy Rituxan, which was an IDEC drug, we turned it down because they thought it would be a niche product, maybe a couple million. It became the largest selling drug in oncology at $7 billion peak sales. So the commercial groups realized that, frankly, their success rates are not much better than the R&D groups.
But the only point I was making, I think the point I really wanted to make was that a vibrant biotech sector, where there are over 100 now public companies and many, many more private, we're not going to solve the pricing issues. I always get asked, so what's your pricing strategy for your gene therapies? I said, I have a perspective on everything, but I really don't believe I have a crystal ball to know how my programs are going to be priced. All I know is that there's a huge unmet medical need in all of these diseases. There's very little to offer these patients. So I presume in good faith that if we can offer solutions to patients, society will come to the table and work out how to adequately reward. That's because I sit in early phase biotech. I think it's very different in the world of late
I don't want to get
phase
into politics of it, but if you read Paul Ryan's things, he I think is trying to advance this discussion because we need some type of special pool of insurance for people like this because we have to have the kind of reimbursement creativity that allows people to invest in, and the economic benefits of doing something like that is so profound to the society, we can't afford not to have these cures as opposed to saying, how are we going to pay for them? So I think we need to force the evolution of the system to find ways to do it. And I actually think we will. When we're faced with these crises, we are going to find solutions as painful as it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that that's going to happen, right? It's going to be a matter of when the therapies are out there, people will try different things. Maybe there'll be some, in fact, not maybe, there will be many hiccups and things won't go perfectly. But I just regard pricing models as another uncertainty. When you're in early stage drug development, you're already dealing with lots and lots of uncertainties. So the pricing is just one additional one on top of that, which can be modeled, and you just have to have some faith that society will pay for innovative treatments, which doesn't happen in all countries, but it does happen in the United States.
But as investors, because a lot of people are investors, you sort of say, what are the headwinds? So volatility and uncertainty in pricing models clearly does impact sentiment. Sure. I think the other one, which we were talking about, is the regulatory environment. Mm-hmm. And I would say that, and I should put my hand up, I sit on the science board of the FDA, so I'm sort of a government employee, but I would say to you that post-Vioxx and post that dynamic where the FDA was really left in a safety-first, public health, I think there's been, again, under Peggy Hamburg's leadership and now under the new leadership, a huge transformation, particularly in oncology. Bob, a remarkable transformation in the way that our regulatory authorities are now viewing their role in enabling important new therapies to get over the finish line.
I'm glad you mentioned that because the FDA, they have a thankless job and they don't get enough credit. And I think Peggy Hamburg goes down in history as one of the
Absolutely.
best FDA commissioners we've
Absolutely.
ever had. You don't evaluate the FDA based on how many drugs it rejects or how as a measure of how tough it is. If it's doing a better job of communicating with industry early about what's required and prioritizing breakthrough therapies, say, over Me Too things, to move the most important things through the pipeline quickly, I think they're doing a pretty good job.
It's much more of a collaborative partnership now, whereas I think it was more of an adversarial sort of relationship, and so I think enormous progress has been made at the FDA under Peggy, and I'm sure under Pazur now it'll continue. It's just, and it's been a true public-private partnership where, industry, the Congress around the PDUFA legislation and the FDA have all gotten together and figured out, how can we get the medicines to patients faster? How can we get the patient's voice more and more into the dialogue, which we're delighted to see, what matters to patients. So I think we're on a great path there with the FDA.
Okay, now I know we want to have some time for questions from the audience. There must be some out there. We will send a microphone around to you. Just raise your hand. Yeah, I see one. Well, there's a couple here in the front, but there's one in the back here. We'll try that first. Oh, no. Okay, let's come up here to the front. Raise your hand again. Yeah, if we could take her first and then you next.
Hi, my name's Deborah McNeil. Advertising drugs on television to tell people to tell their doctor what they should have seems like an incredible waste of money to me. Is this trivial, or is this really something that should be done away with?
Good question.
I'll tell you, it's fascinating, direct to television or direct to consumer on TV. We, as a company, did start it last year for ourselves. So prior to last year, I could say I don't know anything about it. But in the night, it's funny, the thing was, the company industry didn't even lobby to have the right to advertise on TV. The FDA preemptively did it because they were afraid that there were third parties going to sue that for the right of free speech, and it was put in as a surprise. And believe it or not, we offered in the Affordable Care Act negotiations to give up the tax deductibility of television advertising. And the television industry and everything else said, no way, you're going to let the government's going to agree to do that. It's amazing how many commercials there are. The reality of it is they're actually very significant, that many patients who are don't feel they're aware of what's happening. They actually raise the dialogue and discussions. I don't think ever a patient should control their destiny, but it should be in concert with the doctor. And I think that's got to be an important issue in the dialogue of it. It's a tough issue for our industry. Like I talked about before, the structural imbalances in terms of co-pays and things. I mean, I have 3 kids, and I remember watching on ESPN that my 8-year-old daughter asked, "What's erectile dysfunction?" I'm saying, "Oh my God, what the hell?" I'm good friends with John Lechleiter and Ian Reed. I said, I can't wait for those 2 drugs to go generic so they won't advertise them anymore. Bladder incontinence or psoriasis, I can deal with that a little bit more. But it's really hurt our industry's perception because it looks terrible. But the reality of it is, from a public health point of view, it has actually served a benefit to encourage people who have given up to come back into the system and look for solutions. And I'm a big believer in the medical community, the strength of physicians, that I can't believe that if my mother's 96 years old, she goes to her doctor and says, "I want you to prescribe me this." And the guy, man or woman, would do it because some person watched television and said, I think it might encourage the dialogue. So,
although, Bob, I would say that doctors are business people too. And they know that if they say no, that patient might just go to some other doctor down the street.
Right, but then let them go. You got to do what's right for the patient and make sure that you fight. You can't be victims. The patient shouldn't be a victim. The doctor shouldn't be a victim. We all should stand up and be comfortable in making our statements. The reality of it is, overall, I think it has been helpful. It is helpful to the companies, there's no doubt. But I think we need to raise the level when we can.
I think to put it in perspective, though, I think the United States and New Zealand are the only 2 countries in the world that allow it. And I think healthcare outcomes are actually as good or better in most of the countries that don't allow it. So, just speaking, I'm not speaking on behalf of Roche, but just speaking for myself, I think it would. I'm not a big fan of it.
The drug companies have many ways to get their message out to physicians and other targeted audiences.
And in the last 10 years, I've been in many, many meetings over the last 20 years. I used to work on Plavix, and irbesartan, and all the things you've seen on the television over the years. I personally originally was very much against it. I felt it was very, very expensive, and that there were many other ways to get the scientific medical word out there. But at the end of the day, you can't have it both ways. We also passionately believe in enabling patients through the power of knowledge. And so for me, I sort of float both ways, because I sort of feel that if you can, in a responsible way, make it known to patients that there may be an option for them out there for their disease, why shouldn't they have access to that information? So I think it is a very difficult question, but to John's point, when you work in a global company and you've got 55 countries, the only discussion where you're having direct to consumer is in the US. And so one has to believe there are different models that can be equally effective in healthcare systems.
And by and large, when it's done, it works. I mean, the return is positive.
Oh,
so,
yeah. It definitely
there's the aspect of making people aware of treatments, and then in competitive situations, you could argue that there's a game theory argument to say, well, if no one was doing DTC, would be better. Both companies would be more profitable. But it does drive prescriptions. It works. In some cases, not in all.
Another question here in the front. Can we give it to her? And then we have one in the back I saw. Okay.
In a division of my company, we publish a column. And the column goes to about 5 million people. And I get, this is to your point, I get a lot of questions from consumers. Is there a trial? I have this and this illness. I have this and this thing. Is there a trial? And on the other hand, I hear from industry a lot of time, where are the consumers that are willing to participate in the trial?
Big
There
disconnect.
is an enormous gap, and I felt very at odds. I couldn't find an answer. However, I found during this conference there were a number of companies, including yours, that has made efforts to reach the consumer. Yet these are independent efforts. And how can we overcome this so that there is a general place where we can steer consumers to find the answers, and the answers written in a human way?
Okay, that's a good question. Who wants to take that, John?
Well, I totally agree that it's something we can and should do better. It's also on the opportunities to drive down the costs. I don't know what we spend every year at CROs to go out and find patients that meet the criteria that we need for a particular clinical trial, and if that could be done in a more efficient way, in ways that would meet regulatory compliance and other sorts of regulations, so that we could reach out to patients and present the opportunities and better find, again, as we understand disease heterogeneity, and we understand that a medicine we have, a particular molecule that we have, might address a percentage, and it may be a relatively small percentage of a particular disease, then the challenge is to go find that small percentage of patients that have that disorder. If you look at one of our medicines like alectinib, Alcenza, it's a gene that's mutated in about 5% of lung cancer, so typically we'll have to screen 20 patients to find one that has that mutation and then can go on our trial. If there were more efficient ways to do that and to open that to the community, using social media, using other things, that would enormously improve the efficiency of the overall process as we move to a more personalized medicine environment.
Very hard problem. I think I saw a statistic from the incoming FDA commissioner cited that something like 3% of eligible cancer patients in the U.S.
A little higher, maybe 4, right? I think
4%?
That's still tiny, right?
Of cancer patients in the U.S. who are eligible for trials actually enroll. And it's much higher in places like the UK and other European countries.
Well, and that's coupled with the fact that if you go on clinicaltrials.gov, which is where all the studies are, and you add up all of the patients that all of the industry are looking for, they don't actually exist in the world. The world that's addressable, where you can get. So certainly as an industry, we have to work out how to do this better, because the more that we can enable and accelerate cures for patients living with these devastating diseases, the better. And we're really not very good at this. So I think that is an opportunity. The only thing I would point out is that in the rare disease space, there have been these wonderful organizations that have come together and are true partners to the industry, to biotechs, in helping us to educate and to find patients. I think if we can take those models that have worked in certain rare diseases and scale them more broadly, I think we'll start to get to some of the issues that we're talking about.
I think that's where the power of the internet comes in, and helping connect some of these rare disease groups who never would have found each other before. And Faster Cures, a Milken Institute does a very good job of this, by the way. In the back.
Yeah, Carrie Dolan from Forbes magazine. Just wanted to briefly go back to the direct-to-consumer point. Bob, you mentioned that it's the money spent on TV advertising is tax deductible. Is it every dollar a company spends to advertise their drugs on TV tax deductible?
I'm not a tax lawyer, but I believe any expenditure that you make as a company generally depends on the jurisdiction, but I believe any marketing expense or advertising expense is tax deductible.
Yeah, another question here.
You mean in terms of reducing your profit on which you're taxed, or do you mean the actual expense itself?
It's a reduction, well, it's an expense.
Yeah.
On your P&L.
So in that sense, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, question here.
Question for John. You mentioned how most pharma companies don't earn their cost of capital, but they're probably not doing a very good job of managing cost of capital either. And one of the big impacts is public opinion, what's happening with politics. So why doesn't the industry, I mean, the average American probably doesn't even know what immuno-oncology is and how amazing some of these things are and why there's huge value coming out. So you're kind of, the industry's kind of letting the public process, whip them around, and why don't they do a better job on managing that cost? Thanks.
Actually, I think it's a better question for Bob, who was the CEO of Pharma, or still is until very soon, when I think George Skandos is coming. So I think that would be a good question for you, Bob.
Well, I think that we have a number of issues. I think there are so many areas of where we are on the cutting edge in the transformation of bringing science to making really medical advances. And it's an issue that we need to change the methodology that we've had. Our problem has been historically that, again, I don't want to harp on this structural imbalance that we have, that with deductibles and high co-payments and alike, that you could spend billions of dollars to educate people, but as soon as they get that deductible bill, all of a sudden pharmaceuticals are the only cost in the system that is driving us up. And so it's our communication strategy has been focused on basically a number of people in Washington that influence policy and people in state capitals like Sacramento and 11 or 12 other states that are really significant. So it's unfortunate that we don't, and I think that we have meetings coming up in the very next few weeks that are going to really challenge us to re-examine the way we communicate more broadly on all these topics.
Well,
one thing on the taxes, I want to say, I don't mean tax like that you get a reduction in your taxes. It's just an expense on advertising.
Luke, you should talk about your new venture with this way to tell the community about about the excitement around tackling diseases with things like cancer immunotherapy. You were talking about in Boston, there's a new channel of disseminating information for more of a lay public that's opening as an example.
We could talk about the media business, but all I'll say is that the fundamentals of the media business are not as good as the pharmaceutical business.
I don't know. If you take the whole industry, right? Our whole industry is less profitable than the potato chip and the soda industry.
Well, ROI, so not returning the cost of capital. Let's remember there are two parts to that equation. We talked a lot about the ability to earn money because we've delivered value. But there's a cost expenditure part of that, So it's basically you're spending money over 5 to 10 years, and then you're looking then to get the return on that expense. And we talked about a number 2 point something billion for each new drug. That's because we fail expensively and slowly. And so one of the things that I think that I feel very positive about is that finally, I think there's been an enormous amount of effort now to really look at new models of innovation, the partnerships between biotech and industry, new models of regulation, new ways of thinking about personalized medicine and big data. Because at the end of the day, that expense curve, we've got to get that better.
I think that's, the cost of capital issue is something that's very close to us. So we do sort of activist investing where we get involved in companies where they do a bad job allocating capital. And that happens everywhere in the pharmaceutical industry. You think about it, it's a very difficult business to run, right? Because when a company does have a good fortune to develop a drug that works, and it's very, very hard to develop a drug that actually helps humanity, but when that occurs, it is something that's going to be a profitable business for a long time. And it's very easy for the company to say, we're very smart, we know what we're doing, we're going to continue to kind of spend money in R&D programs. It may not be as kind of as thoughtfully designed as their original program that gave them the innovative product. And they have many years over which there's no competition. So in most industries, there's competitive forces that kind of push them back into behavior, whereas if you have a patent on a drug, you get it for a long time, and it's very easy for the companies to sort of fall out of a discipline in capital allocation.
I think the communication challenges come back to that is a huge overhang. It's still with us. And you mentioned the excitement in immuno-oncology that people just don't get yet. A great example last fall, Jimmy Carter goes into long-term remission on a checkpoint inhibitor from Merck. This is a great success story, and it's absolutely drowned out by the Shkreli stuff.
Yeah.
The bad news, that this bad story.
And he wrote a wonderful letter about it, the president. It really should have been on the front page of the newspaper.
No reason this should be as bad as big tobacco. There are problems.
Or lawyers, or congressmen. We're trying to do the right thing.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Please, everybody, join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.